Tonight we are in the book of Job. We're going to be looking at, as I've shared with you, we're going to be looking at some questions that are posed in the book of Job. And tonight we're going to look at how he is a man of questions. And it looks like the font on my thing is not what I put on there before. We had, sometimes the fonts, the type of typing on the screen doesn't work, and so me and Stacy worked real hard to make sure we had all the ones off of my computer on that computer, and evidently I missed one. So nevertheless, Job is a man of a lot of questions, and regardless of what the screen looks like, we can still look at God's Word and see what it looks like from there. But I want to give you just a little bit of a reminder or a little bit of background on Job, and so that's what we're going to where we're going to start off with. The meaning of his name is actually unknown. It's not definitively known exactly what his name means, but there is one possibility, and that is, where is the divine Father? And so basically what that is saying is that Job's name is even a question. Job's name is, the meaning of his name is even a question. And so another thing to think about when you consider the book of Job is the fact that the book of Job is thought to be one of the oldest books of the Bible. Even as old as the book of Genesis and those, maybe even older, because of when the story of Job is to be taken from. Because the time frame of Job's life is estimated to be during the patriarchal period. That's during the time of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, back then, like 2,000 years before Christ was born. And see, Job lived like the patriarchs. He lived to be 140 years old. He lived to a very old age, considering that he lived after the flood, and people didn't live that long after the flood like that many times. Job's wealth was also measured in livestock and servants, and so that points to the fact of when he would have lived. And he also acted as the priest for his family, meaning that there was not a Jewish faith as we know it today, or as we read about in the Old Testament, because there were no priests. And then finally, references to the Sabians and the Chaldeans who attacked Job, and the mention of a certain piece of silver puts in the book of Job, puts his story about 2,000 years before Christ was born. But we know that Job is revered for his faithfulness during his suffering. We talk about someone having the patience of Job. And oftentimes we talk about people in that regard. But when we look at the life of Job, we first want to start asking questions. How did Job's faith survive such a difficult problem or difficult times? Why would God allow such things to happen to someone who is so faithful to him? Job's circumstances brought about a lot of questions as well. The questions in the book of Job, if you read through the book of Job, and I'm currently working through that in my daily Bible reading, if you look through the book of Job, there are a lot of questions going here, there, and everywhere in the book of Job. There are questions from Job towards God. There are questions from God towards Satan. There are questions from family and friends towards Job. And then, probably most importantly, there are questions from God to Job. And so tonight, we're going to look at 5 questions. Well, 4 from the book of Job and 1 that makes good sense. Let's put it that way. But these 5 questions are asked by different people in the book of Job to help gain a better understanding of why suffering happens and how we should respond. The first question we have is, have you considered my servant Job? And this comes from Job chapter 1 and Job chapter 2. When we read about this, we'll see what these verses say here in just a moment. But that's the question, is have you considered my servant Job? That is a question from God towards Satan. See, after we get an introduction as to the type of man that Job was, that he was wealthy, that he was a religious man, we see an interaction between God and Satan in the throne room of God. showing that Satan still has access to the throne room of God, which is important for us because he is called the accuser of the brethren, meaning that he accuses Christians daily in the presence of God. And this just goes to further support that for us. But nevertheless, this is the backdrop for the entire story of the book of Job, for Job's entire life. And this takes up no more than 13 verses in chapter 1 and 2, and it lays the whole background for the entire book that we read, 40-some chapters. And see, God offers up Job to Satan as one who is blameless and upright. He is a blameless and upright man, meaning basically that he lived a very righteous life. He lived a very faithful life to God, and he completely follows God. There's no doubt about his loyalty to God. And Satan accuses God of putting a hedge or a wall of protection around Job, and basically says that the reason Job follows God is because of God's protection, because of God's blessings. And Satan's argument is, take the wall away, let something get at Job, and he won't be as faithful to follow you. And that's what Satan's argument is. And in their first encounter, God allows Satan access to everything around Job except for Job himself. And so he takes away his wealth, he takes away his children, and he does all of that, and takes away his servants as well. And so basically at that point, Job is penniless and he's childless. He's lost everything in his life that was of any real value to him, and I would say that the children were of more value than all the wealth that he had. But in their second encounter, God allows Satan access to everything about Job except taking his life. You can make him as miserable as you want. You can do all of these things to him, but you cannot take his life. That was the one stipulation. And so right here we start to gain an understanding about why suffering occurs. And suffering generally comes about because of one of two reasons. One is that suffering occurs because of Satan. That is one reality for us, because Satan's primary focus in life is to bring about total destruction of everything that God has created and everything that God has made good. Think about what John 10:10 says. Talking about Satan, it says, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. There is nothing good in what Satan comes to do. And see, 1 Peter 5:8 gives us another view of this. It says, be self-controlled and alert. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a, roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. There's nothing good about that. So part of the suffering that we experience here on earth, some of that comes from Satan. But suffering also occurs because of the fallen and sinful world that we live in. And I would dare say that more of the suffering we experience is because of the sinful world we live in than Satan. If I had to say one was more prone to cause suffering, I would say it's because of the sinful world that we live in, and because it's a fallen world that we live in. Now, granted, Satan helped push it past the tipping point to where the world is now by getting Adam and Eve to sin in the garden. But nevertheless, suffering occurs because of the fallen and sinful world we live in. And since Satan was so successful at pulling man into sin in the Garden of Eden, we are now faced with a world that is completely consumed with sin. Our world is completely affected by that. We ask the question, why do bad things happen to good people? Well, that question gets asked a lot. We could ask that question today about one of our own, with Santera and Dwight. We would say, why in the world why would something like this happen to such a young couple that has just started out and that is expecting their first child? And, we can ask all of that. And part of the answer is right here. It's because we live in a sinful and broken world, and because this world is no longer perfect like God designed it. Because sin entered the world, sin caused ripples through every part of God's creation. There is not a part of creation that was not affected by sin. And so part of that is our bodies. Why do we grow old and eventually our bodies give up the ghost? It's because of sin entering the world. The penalty for sin, the wages of sin, is death. Part of that's a physical death, part of that's a spiritual death. But what we understand is that the reason there are complications in life with health. Why do people have cancer? Why do people have heart attacks? Why do people have this disease or that problem? Or why are children and their mothers suffering through a difficult time? It's because we live in a sinful and broken world. That is as good an answer as you'll get for much of this, because we don't always know why God allows it to happen to good or even righteous people. We don't know why God allows it to happen, but we know it is always rooted in the fact that we live in a sinful world. That is the base part of all of it. But that leads us to our second question, and this comes to us from Job chapter 2. And the question is, are you still holding on to your integrity? After Satan visits Job this second time, or visits with God the second time, Satan goes out and he afflicts Job with these very painful boils and sores on his body, to the point where the only relief that Job can get is to take a piece of a broken piece of pottery and to scrape those boils and those sores that cover him from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. I've got this place on my just above my left ankle where I got into some poison oak on the farm here recently, and it is about to drive me crazy. I want to take a piece of broken pottery and just scrape that thing and just scratch it because it's just itching me to no end. I could not imagine what it would be like to have such painful boils and sores all over your body that is the only way you could get relief, is to just scrape and scratch. And if you've ever had poison oak, you know what it's like, or a real bad mosquito bite, those sort of things. But he is in really bad shape. Job's wife had enough. She was done with all of this. She was at that point where she throws her hands up. We could almost see her doing that. And she encourages Job to curse God and die. That's a supportive wife, isn't it? She's like, well, we're just, and you got to think she's struggling through all of this as well, just without the physical aspect. She's lost her children. She's lost her wealth. And now she's lost her husband's health. And she's also lost the presence of her husband, because Job is no longer at home. He's sitting in the ash heap for the city now. He's sitting in the city dump, basically, by himself, where his three friends go to visit him. So she's lost everything except for her health. And so she's just fed up, and she tells Job, go curse God and die. And in the very next verse, we see a very key, we see a key to dealing with suffering when we see Job's reaction to all of these problems. It says in Job 2:10, in all this, Job did not sin in what he said. Not a single time in all that he endured, not a single time in all that he did, he never once said anything that would have caused him to sin. I'll tell you right now, I don't know that many of us could say that about the most difficult suffering we've ever endured in our life. It would, that we wouldn't have thoughts or have said stuff or done stuff that would have been sinful. There are very few people in life that we can say they've suffered like Job. Everybody has different situations in life that may be very difficult and may be just like Job. And we look at Job and see that he lost everything short of his wife and his life. Those are the two things that he had. That was all he had. But through it all, Job never once lost his integrity. He never once committed sin because of the difficulty that he was faced with. See, God tells us in His Word that this is what is expected out of us in everything we do, not just in the good times. This is expected out of us in everything. The suffering in the most, dark places of life, even in the most joyous times of life, we are to maintain our Christian integrity. We are to not sin against God in those times. When we're, God tells us that's what we need to do. See, in Titus 2:7, don't turn there, I'm going to read it to you. This is what it says. In everything set them an example by doing what is good. Paul's writing to Titus, helping him to lead the church that he was responsible for. And he says, in everything set them an example by doing what is good. In the difficult times of life, do what is good. In the great days when everything works out and nothing could be better, do what is good. From the darkest to the brightest days, do what is good. Hold on to your Christian integrity and live a righteous life. When faced with suffering, we must hold on even tighter to our Christian integrity and even more tightly to God. That leads us to our third question, though, and it's in verse 10, as we've been reading right now, the very next verse. It says, shall we accept good from God and not trouble? And this comes from Job. After Job's wife encourages him to, she basically says, go die. She says, curse God and die. Job gives us some very profound wisdom when it comes to handling the sufferings that we face. Because Job tells her, I love the way he says it there. He says, you are talking foolish, woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Obviously, he wasn't married to my wife, because if I'd have told her she was talking foolish, I'd be picking my teeth up off the ground. But it's just so funny to read how, he got frustrated, but he didn't sin. But he's just like, woman, you're talking crazy. That's how we would put it today. Woman, you're talking crazy. Am I going to say, I'm going to take all of these good things from God, and when something bad happens, I'm going to say, no, God, I don't want any? Am I going to sit here with my hands out, and when he gives me something that I don't want, I'm going to draw my hand back? That's basically what Job is saying. He's saying, we can't do that. We can't hold our hands out there and say, God, I want you to bless me. I want you to give me whatever. Give me whatever I need, Lord. And then when he quits giving us things that we see as good, and he gives us things that we see as bad, we're reminded that everything God allows into our life is done for our good, whether we view it as bad or good, regardless. But we're not going to sit there and say, God, give me, give me, give me. And when he starts to give me something that I don't like, then I'm going to draw my hands back and say, no, God, I don't want that. I'll wait until you give me something good. It's sort of like the kid in the high chair. You give them candy or a piece of cake or some little treat or something that they really like, they're going to want. You put them vegetables in front of them, they're like, whoa now. I don't want any of that. No, keep it. Wait until you're giving me something that I want. That's the mentality. It's a childish mentality. Saying, God, I want all the good stuff, but if you're going to give me something that I don't like, I don't want it. It doesn't work that way. As Job puts it, we can't accept good from God and not expect for difficulties to come. And so Job asked, a very good question there. If God allows good things to come into our lives, then when he allows suffering into our lives, are we going to refuse it? Because think about some of the more difficult times in your life where you've suffered, whether it's the loss of loved ones, whether it's your own struggles with your health or family problems or whatever the case may be. There's a whole laundry list we could make. Think about how those times have helped draw you closer to God. Think about how those times have made you rely on him, trust him, draw closer to him, and through that, your faith has been strengthened. And had you said, no, God, I don't want any of that, I'm not going to allow you to do that in my life, think about how much weaker you would be spiritually. Think about how farther away from God, so to speak, you would be, because you wouldn't have learned to draw as close to him as you did during those times of suffering. See, here is a statement that will sound odd at first, but it will make sense as we talk through it. See, God wants to bless us, and sometimes a time of suffering is used to accomplish that. We see times of suffering, we don't see them as a time of blessing. But through that, God is sometimes working to bring about blessings that we don't even know about. When we view God allowing suffering into our lives, we will never know all the reasons why God would allow it. But there is, as we know from Romans chapter 8, that He's working things to our good because we love Him and because we're called according to His purpose. Does that mean that it's always going to be sunshine and rainbows? No. There's going to be times of suffering. There's going to be times of difficulty. And He's working even those times for our good. See, we can look in the Word and see two reasons why He may allow those times of suffering. One is that our suffering may be discipline or a result of our own sin. You know, when I was growing up, if I backtalked my mom, I would get a spanking. If I didn't listen to my parents, I would get a spanking, or I would get grounded, or I would get something taken away from me. And that's the way it's worked for, millennia. You get in trouble, you pay the price. There's problems that come along with it. So if we sin and we disobey God, because that's all sin is disobedience of God. If we disobey God, why would we not be surprised sometimes if things that we see as suffering are our discipline from Him because of our sinfulness? It may be a discipline from Him, or it may be that it's a result of our sin. We can't, I was talking with, who was it that I was talking with? I was talking with Rick Krause the other day, and he was talking about, we were talking about something at the association, and he was talking about the side effects. Just because someone in there, someone that he had led to Christ or something that he was talking about, he was talking about how this person used to live one way, and now, that's what it was. He had somebody he knew had been a smoker for years. And because of that, they ended up with COPD and some difficulties there, and had quit smoking, years ago to some degree. I don't know when it was, but it wasn't before the smoking had done damage to their body. And basically what he was saying was that, we were talking about it at the association, and he made the comment that, even though they've quit smoking, there's still there's still ramifications from that smoking. Well, our sin is the same way. That just because we've been forgiven of our sin, and just because we've sought God's forgiveness and we're not sinning like that anymore, doesn't mean that there are not consequences that still affect us physically or affect others physically because of our own sin. And so what we have to understand is that our sin, when we look at this, our suffering may be because God is disciplining us. He might be taking His proverbial hand to our backside, so to speak. Or it may be that the suffering that we're experiencing is a consequence from our own sinfulness. We have nobody else to blame other than our own self for that. Because if we sinned and we're paying the price, then there's nobody else to blame. We can't blame other people. Listen to what it says in Proverbs 15:10. It says, "Stern discipline awaits him who leaves the path. He who hates correction will die." Basically, it's saying here that there is stern discipline for us when we leave God's path. God's going to do what's necessary to discipline us. And if we see it as suffering, it's actually discipline sometimes. But then in Proverbs 3 it says, "My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline and do not resent His rebuke. Because the Lord disciplines those He loves as a father the son He delights in." And so God's going to discipline us if we get out of line. If we sin, He's going to discipline us. And sometimes our suffering, our difficulties are a result of what is truly discipline from the God of the universe. But see, our suffering may be used also to bring glory to God. That's a tough one for us to sometimes get a grip on. This afternoon when Robert and I were down at the hospital, one of the first things we did, because there were probably going to be a lot of visitors coming in and out, and there wasn't at this time, Robert and I had prayer with Bill and Emily and Santera and Dwight and Natalie South. And so we circled up for prayer and was holding hands with Santera and had prayer for her. But one of the things that I prayed for, even in the midst of this difficult time for them, was that God would be glorified through all of this. Whatever that means for God's ultimate plan, that He would be glorified. And sometimes our suffering, as messed up as it sounds to us from a human perspective, our suffering may at times be used to bring glory to God. And that's difficult that's a difficult pill for us to swallow, saying, as Job might be, pointing our fingers at God, saying, why does my suffering have to be used to bring you glory? Why do I have to pay the price so that you can be glorified? You know, how many of us have used the phrase before with God that we'd do anything that He wanted us to do? God, I'll do anything you want me to do. And trust me, that's why you have a preacher, because I was willing to do anything to get out of the position I was in work, and I told God, I'm ready to do anything. I'll do anything you want me to. And that's when He whispers in my ear, preacher, preacher, preacher. I can still hear it. It gives me cold chills today. He brought the words of a speaker that I'd heard earlier that week, and that's the way. And I was told him, I said, I'll do anything you want me to. I can't do this anymore. And that's the week. That's the day he called me into ministry. So be careful what you ask for. I'll warn you about that much. Or how many of us have told Him, I'm yours, Lord, as you need me to be. I'll do whatever you need me to do, Lord. I'll be whatever you need me to be. And sometimes God may need to do anything to bring glory to Him and to accomplish His goals for His kingdom. So we have to be prepared for that. If we write that blank check, saying, God, here is my blank check, you use it however you need to in my life, sometimes that'll be a time that we view as suffering. Look at the case of Lazarus. You don't have to turn there. But he was a man who Jesus loved as much as any person on this earth. And so Lazarus was probably like a brother to Jesus. And he gets sick, and Lazarus ends up dying. And in John 11:4, it says, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. So Jesus knew that the illness that Lazarus was dealing with would not end in his death. Yes, he would die. And yes, Jesus would bring him back, resurrect him from the dead. But that illness would not be the end of Lazarus' life. Lazarus would be resurrected. He'd go on to live and eventually die. But think about this. If Jesus will not spare from suffering someone He loved and cared about as much as He did Lazarus, then why would we expect any less from Him? He was as close as a brother to Lazarus, most likely, but He still would not spare him. And so we can't expect our suffering to be tempered by God any more than Lazarus's was. Here's what we're going to do, Stacy. I want to jump down to the question, where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Okay, you follow me? Okay, and this is our final question for the night. It says, it comes to us from Job 38:4. And so it says, where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? And this is a question. This is our last question for the night. And this is a question from God to Job. See, after Job and his friends go back and forth through most of the book of Job, finally God has the opportunity to address Job about his suffering. And one thing to note is this, that even though God addresses the issue of suffering with Job, and He discusses many things with him, He never once gives Job an explanation for his suffering. God never says, Job, this is why it all happened. This is what it meant. This is why you had to suffer the way you did. None of that ever happens. See, Job ends up being questioned by God. You want to talk about being in a frightful position? It's easy for us to stand here and question God. Why, God? Why would you allow this to happen in my life? Why would you allow this to happen to someone I love? What is the purpose here? And for us to have a shouting match with God. We have those sometimes, even in the Christian faith. Even as we grow more spiritually mature, those happen. But right here, God starts to question Job. And I'll tell you, there's not a lawyer or a prosecutor on the earth that could cross-examine you like God could. And so if He starts asking questions, you better watch out. And unfortunately for Job, he didn't. He went just a little too far, and God started questioning him. And that's what his question was. Where were you when I laid the foundation, or the earth's foundations? Where were you when I created everything? Is basically what God is saying to him. And God is pointing out some key truths about God and our times of suffering. One is this: even when we are in our worst suffering, God is still in control. Even when it feels like our world is collapsing around us, God is in control. If he wasn't, then he's not God. Think about that for a moment. If we think that he is not in control of our life and our situation when it seems like our world is in shambles, then at that point, we don't serve a God, we serve a genie. Because that's what it would be. Because he's not God. He's not sovereign. He's not all-powerful if he's not in control, even in the midst of our difficulties. And that's one of the things, again, going back to today, that's one of the things we prayed today was reminding, Santera and Dwight that in the midst of all of this, God is not surprised by this turn of events, and God is in control. Because in our times of suffering, we need those reminders. We need those reminders that God is in control. But also, we need to remember that even when we are in our worst suffering, God has a plan. God is a God of order. God is not a God of chaos. That comes to us from the New Testament. The Apostle Paul in one of the Corinthian letters. God is a God of order. God has a plan. Even if we can't see the plan, even if we don't know what the plan is, and sometimes we think we've totally missed the plan, God has a plan. And because he has a plan, he's in control. See, we can trust in that. We can trust in the fact that God is in control. And we can trust that God has a plan for whatever difficulties we face. There's a plan to it. And we may not know what that plan is until this life is over, but one day God will share with us what that is. I want to wrap up this message this evening with one verse from the book of Job. And this is Job 37:5. Many of you probably remember last year when we had the Gideon speaker. And I shared with you after he spoke about the Gideon Bible that I found in a hotel room that had been dried open. It had been wet and left to dry. And when Misty and I were there at the beach for a weekend, my grandmother was dying of cancer, and we took 2 days to ride one day to ride to the beach, one night to stay there, and then basically one day to drive back the next day just to get some rest while we were there. Found that Gideon Bible that I shared with you about. And one of the very first verses I read was Job 37:5. It says, God thunders marvelously with his voice and does great things which we cannot comprehend. And when we look at this verse, it sums up tonight's message completely for us. When we think about times of suffering, God does marvelous things that we cannot comprehend. He does things that we cannot understand. We don't understand why good things happen to bad people and why bad things happen to good people. We don't understand why something like the situation that Santera and Dwight are dealing with, we don't understand why things like that happen. But what we do understand is, like I said a minute ago, God is in control. God has a plan. And he does things which we cannot comprehend. But notice what it says there. He does great things. Even in the midst of our suffering, God is still doing great things which we can't understand. It's hard for us to rationalize those difficulties that we face when we face those times of suffering with the knowledge that God is in control. God's not surprised by it, and that he's doing something great even in the midst of my suffering. But that's why we call it a life of faith, because we're trusting him even in the midst of our difficulty. Even when it doesn't make sense to us, we're still trusting in him.